You're watching TelecomTV from the Great Telco Debate 2018. And joining me now is Andrew Coward, CEO of Lumina Networks. Andrew, thanks for joining us again on TelecomTV. We've been talking about 5G for a number of years now, and we are finally starting to see some early deployments. Firstly, where does Lumina Networks fit within the 5G network? And also, from your perspective, why aren't we seeing more deployments?
Yeah, well, first of all, Lumina provides SDN, open source SDN, using OpenDaylight. It turns out that for all of the virtualized services that go into 5G, there's a requirement for SDN to tie it all together. So SDN is absolutely critical for that 5G deployment. And really, what we do as Lumina is provide the open source capabilities to service providers to do that, so they remain kind of agnostic to the actual vendors they're using underneath, and can drive business logic dynamically through the SDN process.
And the fact that the network is heterogeneous by definition, I guess, means that we require a multi-vendor approach.
Right, so for most service providers, they want to be able to build using best-in-class products different times. They want to be able to have competitors working in the same network. And so therefore they need management tools that essentially don't really care about what that underlying infrastructure is. And again, SDN and having something like OpenDaylight in the way provides that capability to say the business logic is now separated or abstracted from what that underlying architecture or what underlying products really are.
And what about the operational complications that CSPs are faced with?
Yeah, well, it turns out that, of course, even though we're implementing a new network with 5G, a lot of it isn't actually new. A lot of it is the existing infrastructure, which needs to be tied together. And that can create operational complexity because a lot of this existing network infrastructure doesn't actually have all of the new tools and the new methods that, say, some of the new virtualization software will have. Therefore, being able to tie the old with the new is critical, and having the software that kind of bridges that gap is really important to get these networks deployed and successful from day one without ripping out and replacing everything.
It's never a single challenge, is it? What do you think the industry needs to do to overcome some of these roadblocks that you mentioned?
So I think most service providers have recognized that open source is a critical component to the future of their networks. And we've seen that not just with how open source is beginning to be deployed, but how the technology movements like a movement to ONAP and so on, how the service providers themselves are pouring resources and effort into making sure that open source gets deployed and gets the right level of attention across the industry. And so that's a critical component, and obviously helping our cause as Lumina, but just across the industry making sure that we're successful through this.
I know that you've completed many 5G proofs of concept and worked with some of the leading Tier 1 operators. Is there a clear win here? Is there a clear win for telcos, or are there some repeating errors that we need to be aware of?
Right, so we're winning for a service provider is getting to 5G deployment and getting software and services out in front of customers. So for that to be successful, the services have to be smooth, scalable, massively deployable. And so getting the cycles of testing and infrastructure in place now, even though they may not be deploying 5G for another year or so, has to be critical. All of the level playing field for the vendors and so on has to be laid out, infrastructure has to be ready, and now is the starting point for that to happen.
And of course, telcos can't neglect the underlay network as they implement new equipment.
No, and so much of what's been talked about in 5G and next generation networks has been this whole kind of, I'm going to build everything on top of my existing infrastructure, I don't have to worry about it. The reality is that, as we talked about, you have to tie the old with the new, the underlay infrastructure together with the overlay infrastructure, so that when you provision, when you orchestrate, all of these things are tied together.
And what is the relationship between open source and telcos?
I think it's been really interesting to hear the traditional vendors talk about why open source isn't the way forward, and how it's too complicated, and how you should continue to use the systems that work. And that's just not the reality of where the service providers are, or where the industry really is. So we're going to continue to see this pushback from traditional vendors, but at the end of the day, every vendor has to come into this ecosystem and play with it, and work in this open source environment. That's just the reality. And it's been forced on them by AT&T and Verizon and Telefonica and all of the large telecoms. They're saying, this is the way forward, you will do this if you want to put your products into my network.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.